Welcome everyone. I am Nirali Narayan, and I am very excited to start our webinar on reparations in honor of Black History Month. So let me introduce myself. I am Nirali. I am a junior at Highlands Ranch High School, and I have been a member of Youth Celebrate Diversity Student Board for about 2 years now. Youth Celebrate Diversity is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to educating and empowering youth in order to advance inclusion and equity for all. One of our fundamental key values is to believe that education is a human right and a critical tool in every young person's life. We believe that change must come from within a community and not from outside forces. And finally, we are working toward a more just and equitable society that values every single human being. I would like to now hand over introductions to some of our panelists here. Would Arthur like to introduce Denver Black Reparations Council first?
Yes, thank you. Nice to meet you. My name is Arthur McFarlane. I am the chair of the Denver Black Reparations Council, and we can give you a little bit more information as we go along about DBRC, which is what we call it. But it's an organization that's just getting rolling on doing reparations in the Denver metro area. We've gone through one cycle of reparations, and we're in the middle of a second cycle. And we can talk more about what that has looked like for us and what that journey has looked like as we go through some of your questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Would Tamara Rhone like to introduce next?
My name is Tamara Rhone, and I'm on the board of the Denver Black Reparations Council. And I have taught for 45 years. I've finished my teaching career, and I'm working with DBRC, and that takes up a lot of my time. And I'm also doing curriculum consulting and writing.
Thank you so much. And next, David Ali from Reparations Circle Denver.
I am one of the co-founders for this group. It's what they call an affinity group of the Denver Foundation. And we started, goodness, about 4 years ago, I think, and helped to bring together a small group of folks that had an interest in what reparations meant. And that led to helping to start up this group that we've talked about, the Denver Black Reparations Council. I'm a retired businessman and happy to be involved in this effort to do some important social justice work that should have been done a long time ago. Glad to be here.
Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you also to our participants who are here to watch the webinar. So I'll start off the discussion with a couple of questions, and we can talk more about what each of your organizations like to do. So first, a very basic question. What are reparations, and what is the definition of the word?
That sort of depends on who you talk to sometimes, I think. Often when we think about reparations, we think about the restorative justice, we think about issues related to social justice. And that includes taking a look back in history to what was done to African Americans in these United States, going back to 1619 and coming forward. Now, many folks will think about reparations in terms of before that time period, in terms of what was going on in Africa and what then was the relationship between Africans and Europeans and what started the whole transatlantic slave trade. And that's all well and good. There's nothing wrong with looking at that period in history, but we tend to start at the time period when Blacks were first brought to this country. And coming up to now, whether or not your family was a slaveholder or whether your family were slaves as part of their time here in the country, we also see that slavery has more than just the impact that it had from 1619 until the ostensible abolition of slavery in 1865, we see that there are lots of holdovers or lots of things that were still going on in this country and still are going on in this country that relate back to that slavery period. And so when we talk about reparations, we're talking about repairing people of color, Black people in particular, from that time frame for the things that have happened to them. And that often involves giving them the opportunity to fully participate in what the United States offers, whether that's having land or getting an education or being just a full member of this society, which, as we know, isn't something that happens because there are real systems in place to keep Black people from achieving those goals, those kinds of goals. And so whether or not your family has slaves in it, you still deserve reparations. Black people still deserve reparations in this country for various other things that have happened to them since the end of slavery. And so we look at reparations very broadly, and we look at the idea of giving reparations in the community that is where we started, primarily Denver, but throughout the state of Colorado, as something that is deserving for all Black people who are there. So we are moving forward on that assumption that we're looking at organizations that are Black owned and Black led when we talk about giving reparations to an organization. Or certainly we look to someone who is self-identifying as being Black if we're giving reparations to an individual. So lots of little nuances in there that we could dive into, but they're rabbit holes, and they're rabbit holes that, quite frankly, we've decided to avoid and just kind of say, no, we're not really that interested in having some in-depth discussion about the here's, where's, and why's, and what for's of giving reparations. We're more interested in getting money into the community and beginning to heal the harm.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. My next question to lead off of that would be, why are reparations necessary even today? And how do they play in from historical past if people today have, say, nothing to do with enslaving Black people?
That to me is one of the most important pieces, because so quickly I hear people say, my family came over from Europe in 1960 and we didn't own slaves or whatever. The problem that I find, and if you look at the United Nations definition of reparations, it addresses it quite well, because in fact, when you look at what occurred at the end of the Civil War, you still have a glorified type of enslavement that continues on in this country today. We're looking at it every day when you have governors that are trying to erase proper education for all people across the board. I used to always tell my students, you need to take European history as well as African-American history. That needs to be reciprocated. We all make the world go round. It is also significant in the sense when you look at, you still have people like Jackson, Mississippi. If you study the water issue in Jackson, Mississippi, those that are being adversely affected are people of color. The irony of it is the majority of people are people of color, but the people who control the system are not people of color. So it's not just enslavement. It deals with education, housing, banking, every policing, all kinds of structures within the country. And it's still a problem today. It's something that needs to be addressed, and then you don't repeat it. And that's been the problem as well. We put things in place, voting rights, things like that. They're taken away again. And we keep repeating this, this egregious behavior. And so it's not just about, if you benefit in any way at the expense of another group of people, there needs to be some recompense, some redress of those grievances.
So how would reparations function in today's society, since all of this is such a systematic issue that has been going on for hundreds of years, and people of color have been at a disadvantage for centuries? How would reparations work in our society? Would Congress need to pass certain bills for states like Jackson, Mississippi to reform?
Who do you want to address it?
Either of you or any of you can.
Well, I think that it's multi faceted here. Certainly, I think we're doing things at the local and state level that are effective, that address specific problems within our group. And I think those things are effective. And it does not mean that we leave the federal government out of it. I think that the federal government needs to do a study, which is why I support HR 40, because all they're asking is, let's take a look at it. And why it's so difficult to pass, let's take a look at it, is beyond my comprehension. But they need to take a look, and from there they can form a plan and address it at the national level. In the meantime, there are plenty of things that can be done at the state and local levels as well. We've got massive projects here that we have to look at.
Mm-hmm. David or Arthur, do either of you have anything to add?
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to put into the chat, I don't know whether everybody can see it, but this is a link to House Bill 40, because I think Tammy's right. It's people need to read that to understand, goodness, 30 years, this legislation in one form or another has been introduced and reintroduced, and but it never has really reached a point of even hearings until just a couple of summers ago. And finally, there were at least some preliminary hearings, and unfortunately, it's never made it to an actual vote on the floor. And right now might be a pretty bad time for that vote to occur as politics shift. But it's an effort to understand. It's a study. It's to look at, in a serious, thorough way, at the harms that have resulted. And some studies have actually pointed up the billions of dollars, probably trillions of dollars, that our economic system has lost as a result of not allowing the productivity, the kind of contributions that would have happened if people had not been classified, had not been enslaved, had not been called less than human. And then the economy has suffered as a result, not to mention the harms, obviously, to Black Americans.
Yeah, I think we've got a lot of work to do to understand the true history. As Tammy mentioned earlier, there are people in this country who would just as soon not have that history uncovered. It's very easy for the United States to point the finger to China or to Russia or to Myanmar or to any of the other countries that we've pointed our fingers at in regards to human rights, when we don't allow our human rights issues to be examined, our human rights issues to be brought to the forefront and to have a light shined on them. I think if this country were to admit to the basically horrific kinds of ways in which it was formed, whether that's slavery, whether that's stealing land from Native Americans and First Peoples here, whether that is taking the land of the Native Hawaiians. There's, you talk about HR 40, there was a study done to look at Hawaiian sovereignty. And that study showed, by a study done by the Congress, showed that the Hawaiian Islands were stolen through the use of the military, the Marines, and through the use of corporate structures to steal the islands from the Hawaiians. And so there's plenty of blame to go around. There's plenty of information out there that needs to come to light. There's plenty of need to take a harder look at what's going on in this country and how this country was formed in order for us to understand the fabric in which we live. The fabric we live in is tainted with some very, very horrific kinds of things that were done in the name of progress, or in the name of profit, or in the name of people's right to be even more rich than they already are. And so I think there are lots of things there that need to be considered when we consider reparations.
As a
And
matter of
I'm
fact,
very glad. Sorry, go ahead.
just a quick comment. I mean, it's a really sad and a kind of just amazing paradox that, you know, reparations have been paid, but they were paid to white people after the Civil War because their property had been taken if they were Southern farmers. So I think there's just this kind of bizarre paradox that reparations is not something that has never been paid with regard to slavery, but it was paid to the wrong people. And so I just find that an appalling kind of part of another chapter of history that when we're talking about reparations, yeah, we got to remember that there is this chapter that has been unfortunately part of our real history as well.
Definitely. And Arthur, I'm very glad you brought up the fact that reparations is not just Black Americans, but all across for all different kinds of groups. I think oftentimes when we say reparations, people tend to only focus on one group when it goes so much more beyond that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we were sitting down to have a conversation about reparations once before, we got into the conversation about where does this sit for Native Americans, for indigenous populations here. And there has been a series of articles that say, well, you know, Native Americans were paid reparations. Well, then you talk to Native Americans, well, there were a few pennies thrown at a few treaties that were broken, and that's not really reparations for Native Americans when you look at the totality of the harm that was done. Certainly there were reparations paid to Japanese. On an international scale, there were reparations paid to Jews. And so we can look at where these things have happened and have been done. But when you look at some of the individual cases, you lose that sense that reparations has really been paid in the ways and to the fullness of, and that's really necessary to bring people back to the level of being whole, bring people back to the level of being equal class citizens within a society, within the American society for sure. And it's not just about money. And I think that's the other part of the conversation that we always need to have too, is it's not just about paying people dollars. It's about being able to participate in the society without having the rules and the laws and the regulations being stacked against you. There are plenty of rules that were passed, laws that were passed throughout this country, federal level, county level, city level, that really specifically worked against Black people achieving any kind of equality in this country. So there's a lot of work to do around reparations, not just being able to throw a few dollars at it. And when I say a few dollars, there are estimates that run as high as 17 trillion. You know, and I don't know that would do it either. I just recently read an article from the Washington Post talking about $5 million per Black person to people in San Francisco. And some folks going, well, yeah, that's too much. And then other people say, well, no, that's not enough. And other people arguing, well, that'll just bankrupt the city. And, you know, so there's a lot to be raveled when we talk about reparations, and there's a lot of conversation that needs to be had in order to get to a point where we're not only giving but doing the right things to bring reparations about in this country.
And if folks have chat open, I just plugged in the same article I read this morning. Well, Arthur was talking about it in Washington Post. It's instructive as far as a current effort that's underway in San Francisco to try to figure out how to go about doing reparations.
There are a lot of cities that are wrestling with this. I mean, we've been in touch with the folks in Evanston and folks in Asheville, and there are folks all over the country trying to do this. City levels or with municipalities, at state levels with government. We are not any of those either. Our model is very different than those models. Our model is a private model where people who are private donors are donating to a fund, and that fund is then run by a group of Black people to disseminate the dollars. Now, whether or not our model is perfect or better than someone else's model, that's for history to decide. We can leave that for folks to figure out 50 or 100 years from now. Not interested in having that discussion either. We're doing it the way we're doing it because we've got a group of friends who are willing to work with us to make it happen. And it's a step in the right direction as far as we're concerned.
Well, I also think that's the beauty of having local and state reparations, because you're actually tailoring it to the needs of that community. And national is definitely needed because there are some general things that need to be done across the country. And one of the things that I realized as I got into this work, and why I got into this work, is we really have an illness in this country. And it's like catching a cold. When you catch a cold, when you have other people in that household, they're going to catch that cold as well. And it doesn't matter what age they are, it doesn't matter what color they are. And what ends up happening is then there's an illness all the way through. Until we have a wellness throughout this country will never be well. And I just sometimes think, I try to imagine what this country would be like if we had done the right thing from the beginning, and how far we would be working together. Would we have that cure for cancer? Would we have all of these things, but we held that kid back in school because we didn't want to educate them? There are so many things that we are missing out on, and we need to work together to fix it.
Yeah, I remember having this conversation with a dear friend of mine who is the daughter of Dr. Charles Drew, who is the physician who helped to discover how we can use plasma in blood banks and save it and really preserve the ability to help one another, whether we're Black or white, through the use of blood and blood transfusions. And I talk with Charlene all the time. It's just like, if her dad had not been in the position that he was in, if he had not gotten the education, if he had not had the opportunity, if he had not had the research skills, if he had not been listened to, right, during the time that he was, what would have happened during the World War in terms of transfusions and saving people's lives, and what would be happening today? And he's just one example of one Black man who was given an opportunity to use his intelligence to bring us to a place that is better for everyone. And as Tammy says, we don't know how many of those opportunities were missed during the slavery and post-slavery periods.
Definitely. I think another question I would like to pose out is, if when paying reparations, would you only focus on descendants of Black people that were enslaved, or would this pertain to all Black people in America?
We believe it would pertain to all Black people in America, primarily because the systems that were put into place during slavery times and the systems that have been maintained post-slavery impact African Americans just as much as slavery did, if not more in some senses. one can get to a pretty cynical place pretty quickly if you really start to think, well, Black people were free, but Black people were set free from a chattel slavery system, yes. And Reconstruction was implemented, and Reconstruction got started and then was crushed, right? You can get to a very cynical place when you start to think, well, these things were done on purpose. These things were not accidents. They were things that were done in order to maintain a system that was run by a group of people who were in power, who wanted to maintain that power, didn't want to let it go. And consequently, then they started to build further systems over time, layer after layer after layer of systems that were designed to maintain the original system. So yeah, I don't think that there's any doubt in our minds that the people who were held as slaves and people who are descended from those people should get reparations. But I think the rest of the Black people in this country have been subjected to a system that's at least as egregious as that system was, and so deserve reparations just as much as they did.
We have had, if you look at our history in policing, we've had many African immigrants that have been murdered by police, and so on. And I find when you get into that, are you Black enough argument, that's a slippery slope. I don't look the way I look because of a love match. And so therefore, I was wrought as a descendant of violence that was visited upon one of those slave mothers. So I have always felt like if it is needed and it will help to uplift the body, the whole, then let's do it. I would prefer to err more on the giving and helping and uplifting than you're not Black enough, you can't get it. There was that one drop rule, and I always tease and say, y'all made that law, I didn't.
Yeah, exactly.
You made the one drop rule. And so if it will help to uplift and make the livelihood of the body better, so be it. That's just my opinion.
Do you think that all white Americans would or should be required to pay reparations? And if so, how would they do that?
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I think it absolutely is a responsibility for Americans at the federal level, as we were talking earlier, to take care of this. And that means that's going to have to come from a tax kind of base in order to do the kind of level of repair work that needs to be done. And I wanted to throw that word out. Sometimes reparations is such a complicated word that I think using the idea of repair is a better way to get. And so how do you repair a problem that is so deeply entrenched, so fundamental to the way that all of our systems are built today? And so to undo that kind of injustice, I think, yes, everybody has to contribute, and white people can't elect to say, well, that's not my relatives that were involved in that. So I think at the macro level, the answer is yes. And at the micro level, not to get too philosophical here, but you talked about one of the kind of values that Youth Celebrates Diversity have. You talked about the idea of education as a human right and change from within your community. Well, I think change needs to happen within white people. And one of the reasons that some of us have been working, for instance, I go to a church, First Unitarian Society of Denver, and for several months, for nearly a year, we looked at a toolkit that was done by, I'll put that in chat actually, the Movement for Black Lives Matter have a Reparations Now toolkit, and we tried to educate ourselves because we've been brought up in this environment where we haven't really understood what it means to be white. You know, what are the advantages I've got by not only being white, but being male, you know, and educated. And so there's this pyramid of privilege that I've been standing on without even knowing it. And so there is a learning process that I would go on a limb and say all white people, you know, need to understand, because there's a kind of implicit bias that we have been raised with without even knowing it quite often. I won't get on a soapbox, but I think that answers, from my perspective, at the macro and the internal change within perspective, that absolutely white people need to be deeply engaged in.
Definitely. So not just limited at the federal level, but to also change our perspectives that have been ingrained on how our privilege affects us in our day-to-day lives.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So I wanted to also touch on how realistic this could be to, you know, for people with money and power and privilege to vote, elect people who would basically be giving a part of their wealth away. So how likely do you think it is, or how realistic, and how can we help make change when people in power are in charge of these things?
If you had asked me that question 5 years ago, I would have probably told you that I found it to be highly unlikely that we would ever get to a point where people would, as you say, voluntarily give up money to serve this cause. However, we just gave away $50,000 last year. We gave it away to 7 organizations in the Denver metro area. So it's not only realistic, it's already been done. We did it. Period. There's no discussion about can it be done, and quite frankly, quite honestly, there is no discussion about can it be done again, because we're in the midst of our second grant drive, and we will give away twice as much money this time as we gave away the last time. So it can be done. It's being done. You know, and people who there's an old saying: people who don't believe something can be done should get out of the way of the people who are doing it. So you know, we are already doing it. So the question isn't can it be done? It is being done. The question is, can it be done at the level that it should be done, that it needs to be done? And that's a larger problem, because you do have to work in all of these areas that Tammy and David have been talking about, which is, you know, at the legal, at the level of food, at the level of education, at the level of government, at the level of corporations, at the level of the military, social justice, you know, reparative. We can go down the list of social determinants, and we can point to specific laws, specific things that have been done to create barriers for Black people in all of these areas. So there's lots of things that we can grab a hold of and say, these things need to be repaired, these things need to be changed, in addition to people giving dollars so that other folks can have an opportunity to help their business survive, help their family survive, help put a roof over their head, help put food in their stomach. All of those things are things that money can buy, but there are things that money can't buy at the same time. So we've got a lot of work that we are going to do in order to put these dollars into the community to make sure that we're being helpful along those lines. But there are a lot of things that we need help with, from an advocacy position, from a political perspective, from a societal perspective, from a lot of different angles to make this all change.
Definitely. Thank you.
I put in a website, reparationsforslavery.com, which was put together by Lottie Liebdula. And there are a lot of examples of how people can get involved within that, as well as a lot of educational pieces. It's a great website for gaining understanding. It's huge. And if you're searching for relative anything, there's all kinds of things on it. It's I actually just like to go on and see what I can find next. There's such a wealth of information. The other thing is, you know, spreading the word and let people know. one of my favorite TV shows is called The Equalizer with Queen Latifah and Lorraine Toussaint. And they had an episode on last night where Lorraine Toussaint's character was friends with a couple and they were getting their house appraised. It was a Black couple. And they said that their house appraisal came in for half as much as the neighbor on the same block. And so she had a white friend come in and busted the guy who was giving these bad appraisals. And I thought, what a cool, entertaining way to spread that information so that people know that this housing discrimination is still going on right now. And yet it was done in an entertainment way, but it got the word out. So there's a lot of ways that you can get information out to help affect that.
You know, and Raleigh, you asked a question about voters. You know, one of the nice things about being in Denver is we have complicated ballots with lots of things, but let me give you one thing that I find hopeful, and that was about 2 or 3 years ago, the voters of Denver decided that they were going to set aside some sales tax dollars to go to work for climate justice and climate issues. And we taxed ourselves to do that. And there is between 30 and $40 million a year that's going into a variety of climate issues, including a subcommittee that I'm on, environmental justice. And so voters can do things like that. We can have ballot initiatives. I mean, Denver isn't Colorado Springs and other places, but Denver can do some unique things. So I think it's not out of the realm of possibility that things like this at the local level, maybe someday the federal level. Clearly billionaires are going to protect themselves, but you know, there are a lot of other folks that are going to say, you know, justice is important too, and there are things we can do. That's one example, at least, maybe as a hopeful model.
Thank you. And I believe that I went to your workshop in which you showed the reparationsforslavery.com website at the Youth Celebrate Diversity conference. And it's a really helpful website in gaining more knowledge about the different ways we can get involved. So that poses my question of how can we get the youth to give this issue the importance it deserves, and how can we have other youths to be as involved about this cause as it needs?
Well, as a high school teacher, I say form a club.
Yeah. That's what we did when we were kids in student government. We just formed a committee, found a group of like-minded folks, formed a committee, formed a club, and said, yeah, we're going to do that. And, you know, I think that's an effective way to do the work for a handful of reasons, because when you gather like-minded people together and you start to divide the work, then you get an opportunity to do more. You get an opportunity to communicate with folks, whether that's putting out a newsletter or a newspaper or something on a regular basis, or holding rallies, holding educational classes. You get the opportunity to work with your teachers, with people who have a little bit more experience, a little bit more wisdom than you might have, and a couple more resources, hopefully, to be able to say, hey, you know, we want to push this forward and we want you to help us do that. You also get the ear. David mentioned earlier that we have a kind of, in Denver, you have a really kind of a unique space. And in Denver and in Colorado in general, you've got a very open legislative system in some ways. You can go into the state legislature meetings and you can watch them, and you can watch them making decisions. You can read about it. You can search it online. You can go into a meeting and they will give you an opportunity to speak. You can get your voice heard in our legislatures throughout the state, and in varying different forms. You can run for office yourself. So I think there are a lot of opportunities out there for young people to drive this message, to drive home the idea that this needs to be done, and to hold the rest of us accountable, hold older folks who should know better accountable for the things that they're doing and the things that they're not doing. David mentioned environmental justice earlier. I think that's one of the biggest places where young people should be holding their elders accountable, because their elders are the ones who are going to be responsible for leaving them this mess. Same thing on the economic side, in terms of the debt and some of those issues. We are going to be leaving you with something that you really don't deserve to have on your shoulders. It reminds me very much of what's often done, or what often happens for Black people in the education system, where they have to borrow so much money to get an education that by the time they get their education done and they get a job, significant percentages of their dollars are going to just pay back loans. And that does not leave them money then to buy a home and create the intergenerational wealth that a home really represents. So there are lots of parallels when you start to look at how reparations needs to be done, and how those pieces fit together in a society that was created to keep Black people out of it.
I guess I would add, I was a debater in high school, and so I kind of think high school kids can push back. I mean, these days when there's discussion about, well, now, you know, this book, maybe we don't read, there are people that are trying to ban books, essentially. And I think there's nothing more persuasive than high school students showing up at a school board meeting and saying, we want to know, we want to learn, and we are not going to stand for our library being prohibited from having books that we need that tell the true history of this country, not just the history that's been white kind of sanctioned. And so I would encourage kids to think seriously about pushing back.
That's a great point. Since I go to Highlands Ranch High School, it's a Douglas County school, which has a lot of issues in banning books or trying to prohibit diversity programs and such. And it is getting out of hand, and oftentimes students like myself feel powerless when we are trying to make change or form clubs and have these meetings. So I think it's really crucial to put out there that we can attend these board meetings and such and advocate for our voices out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Right
I think the power to vote is a power that has to be answered. Okay. People in power have to respond to that vote in one form, fashion, or another, or they have to eventually admit that the system that they created is unequal, that one person isn't one vote, that the votes that the rich have hold a greater sway than the votes that the poor have. It really becomes an existential issue when you start to unravel some of these different pieces. And at the base of this unraveling process are individuals like yourselves, who are saying, I'm not willing to listen to this way anymore. I'm not willing to stand for this anymore. I'm going to create a new way for this to happen. I'm going to go outside of this system, and I'm going to create a new system. Those are all pieces of a puzzle that are part and parcel of what revolutions are made out of. And when you look back in history, you do not find revolutions that are founded by the lowest class or caste of people in a society. It is often the middle class and upper middle class people who find themselves structurally prohibited from moving forward, and then decide that they're going to really revolt against the ruling class, whatever that ruling class may look like. And so you really do have, as a structural piece of the puzzle within your hands, the ability to do that. And it's quite, as far as I'm concerned, in the current state of communications, the current state of tech, you have an even greater tool. It's faster, it's quicker, it's much more resilient, and it's a lot harder to resist in many ways than it used to be. I think back on my great-grandfather, his work with the Crisis magazine. Crisis magazine, when he started publishing it in 1910, used to cost a dime. And so if you didn't have a dime, you couldn't buy one. What they found when they looked back is the Crisis magazine was handed from person to person to person. Not everybody could afford it, but the person who bought it would hand it off to somebody else. And 10 people would read that one magazine because they couldn't afford to purchase it. In this day and age, you don't have to have a lot of money to reach a lot of people. And that means you have a greater power to make change happen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and just to give one example, and I don't know the details, but I've sort of followed through the media that I think 4 young Black students in Denver public schools have created a podcast, and they use a term, no justice, no peace, and got it trademarked. And then the school district said, oh, well, we'll just sort of take over that term. And then I think there's a lawsuit. And well, that's to be a good example of where students can flex a little muscle and do some.
I think they backed off. The district
Yep.
backed off because it did not look good in the media that they were doing academic theft.
Intellectual theft.
Yes,
Exactly.
it did not look good at all.
Egg on your face.
And there are so many things that you all can do. And, you know, if they say you can't have the club at school, you've got Zoom, you've got houses, you know how to have meetings outside of school. I grew up in that era, so I'm very familiar with that as a kid of the 60s and 70s, when they were always saying we couldn't do something. Oh, that just gave us more push to get it done.
Mm-hmm.
And the key is to do the homework, get educated about the subject, and then make your plan from there. And believe you me, it doesn't have to be huge. It could be something like raising funds to help pay for school lunch. I don't even think that's an issue anymore, but just as an example, to pay school lunch bills in a poverty-stricken school. You know, I mean, it can be as simple as that. You know, you could figure out what fits and what works for you. And the other thing that we used to do, because when I was a Black Student Alliance sponsor at East High School, we actually did an exchange day with Cherry Creek High School back in the early 1980s. And we would have kids from Cherry Creek come to East, and then our East kids would go over to Cherry Creek. We had some parents from Cherry Creek that would not allow their children to come to East because they thought it was too dangerous. So it, you know, and it again, you have that perspective. I mean, we're dealing with that now. So, you know, there are plenty of things that you can do.
And do you have any advice for when students who are attempting to make change face obstacles, either with their school, their district, or anything?
Sure.
Data, and more data. The proof is in the numbers. The reason that you can step up to a microphone and make a convincing argument is in the data themselves. And you know, it's not always about data. I think there are highly convincing emotional arguments out there. There are highly convincing political arguments out there. So the data argument is not in and of itself an end-all be-all, but it's really important that you understand the level of damage that's being done and the level of damage that has been done in this country. And that's in the numbers. That's in the numbers of people who have died. And I would say it's one of the numbers that we don't know is one of the more compelling numbers for reparations that I know of. And that is the number of people who died in the period from when they left Africa to when they reached the mainland, wherever that was, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, or North America. How many people died in that transatlantic trip is a number we will never know.
No,
but that number is as compelling as anything else.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Right. I would say, you know, at this juncture too, if you have pushback, get your parents in the loop as much as possible, and have that backing and support. And if they're giving you grief in the building, move it off campus,
Mhm.
and have your meetings off campus. And like I say, keep the adults in the loop. You know, obviously you want those that support you and, you know, will help you. And they also increase the education of everybody because you'll have great allyship with the adults.
Definitely.
I would say also don't be shy about contacting the media.
Mm-hmm.
The Colorado
Mhm.
Sun, I just put into chat, there are bills right now about gun control. And, you know, there've been recent examples of shootings outside of, but near high schools.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
If high school students want to do the research that Arthur was talking about, prepare a 2-minute kind of statement, your representatives would probably be delighted to have you make a comment, show up and testify. You can even testify through Zoom these days.
Mhm.
Yeah,
But
because
that,
the reality of it is those children don't want that happening outside of their school. And then, of course, their school gets blamed for it. I taught at East most of my career. They've had 2 shootings this year. Neither one of those shooters were East students, and they actually didn't know the students that they were shooting at. This
Mhm.
is, and you know, they want a safe environment as well. The children do. And it's so unfair what's going on because now people are going, oh, East High School isn't this, isn't that. And it's not East High School at all. It's what's going on outside in those areas. People didn't say Columbine is a bad school because of what happened at Columbine.
Right.
It's no different.
That's right.
Yeah, definitely. As we wrap up, I would like to ask all 3 of you to maybe go more in depth about how your organization does local work around Denver and these communities to help with reparations.
Well, David alluded to something I think we can fairly well talk a little bit about FUSD and the dollars that they've donated. The church, as David indicated, went deep into the reparations issue, deep into educating themselves about slavery and about racism and social justice in this country, deep into reading and learning about the things that they weren't taught as children, and changing the ideas within their own heads and their own minds about what this country is about and what this country means at a race level. And by doing that, then saw the need and saw the requirement to go in and fix, to go in and make better, to go in and try to repair. And because of that, they've donated over $200,000 to the Denver Black Reparations Council to use as money to go out and do the reparative work that we do. So it is absolutely part and parcel of what we want to do, and that is to build those kinds of relationships with people who are open to the kinds of changes that we believe are necessary, and to go through and build those on a long-term sustainable basis where we can put together the organizations that we would then give money to with FUSD, with them to be able to help bridge some of those gaps of understanding, help build the kinds of trust between the communities that's going to be necessary to make a sustainable change. So as we dig deeper into this work, it's not just about the money, it's about building these relationships and making sure that we stand by our word, which is just to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to eliminate social injustice in this country.
Mhm. Do you think that there will ever be a complete set amount that we can give back to these communities that will ever fully?
How could you do that? I mean, when you start to think your way through that one, it's just like, you never get, it's like the MasterCard commercial. It's like, $5 for this and $10 for this, and this thing over here is priceless. Well, to me, my friendship with David Alley is priceless. You can't pay me enough money. You can't give me enough money for me to change that relationship, to disavow him as my friend. So how do you put a dollar figure on that friendship? How do you put a dollar figure on the commitment that he's made to this work? How can you put a dollar figure on the commitment that he's made to me to help me make sure that I continue to be strong and move forward in this work? You can't. So there's no dollar amount that you can put to it. You can only look at the results and say, here's what we've done, here's how we've done it, and here's what we intend to continue to do.
So just a continuous effort.
The other thing is that you have to look at the structures that are in place, and until they are fixed, it will continue to occur. Whether it's housing, banking, education, environment, the legal system, the policing, and so on, until those structures are fixed or eradicated and built up into a new form, it will continue. So there's no way that you can put an end dollar amount, because the egregious behavior continues.
I completely agree. And the idea that there could ever be a kind of one and done, fix some, and now we've solved it is short-sighted and just misguided. The idea is we've got deeply rooted systems. We have problems, these gaps that need to be bridged. It's an ongoing kind of process. And so I think that's where the commitment is needed to continue to try to work to do these forms of repair that will continue indefinitely, because the problems are that deep.
Definitely. Thank you. Those were all great responses. I'm not sure if we can ask the participants any questions. Is that possible? Or
if you could do it in about 2 minutes.
Yeah, people want to throw something in the chat, we probably could answer 1 or 2 questions that people put in the chat. I don't know if their chat comes through to us or not. But I think one of the things that I find most gratifying about the work that we've been doing is to see and understand where we started. And this is not to pat ourselves on the back or to say by any means that we've reached the end of this journey. But, as I mentioned earlier, if you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said, reparations is just not something that we are ever going to see happen in a real form in this country, because there's just been so much pushback against it as a word, as a concept, as something that actually could be done across the board. But here we are, and it has been done. And the group of people that has come together to make it happen is amazing. They are amazing in their constant belief that this is something that needs to be done, their willingness to share their talents and their treasure to make it happen, and their willingness to go out and reach out and find other people who are like-minded and believe in it, and even those who don't believe in it, and convince them to come over to this side of the equation. That's what is so amazing and gratifying to me as I've been doing this work now. And I just want to say thank you to all of them for their continued participation and their continued belief that this is the right direction to go.
It's amazing to hear a more positive and gratifying statement, because oftentimes with social justice work, we often just hear the continuous efforts that we have to put in, and the fight never ends, and you have to keep going, and there will forever be injustices in the world. But for the little accomplishments that we make, even just looking 50 years back from now, is huge. And the progress that we are making is amazing. And I think that is the crucial thing that should drive us to make even more progress. So I really appreciate having all of you here on this webinar today.
much.